I never thought moving into a quiet suburban neighborhood would turn into the most stressful battle of my life. What started as a dream home quickly became a nightmare when the HOA decided my property wasn't really mine to control. They built their rules into every corner of my life. And then, they crossed a line I couldn't ignore. The moment I realized just how far they were willing to go, I knew I had to fight back. But the way I did it, let's just say they never saw it coming. Would you have done the same in my place? When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I'd found the perfect place to build a future. The streets were quiet, lined with freshly painted houses, trimmed lawns, and families who waved as they passed. My home sat at the edge of the community. A spot I loved because it gave me just enough privacy while still being part of everything. At first, life there felt almost too good to be true. Weekends meant grilling in the backyard. Evenings were spent walking under the glow of porch lights. And for a while, I believed I had finally found peace. But if you've ever lived under an HOA, you already know how quickly that dream can turn into a nightmare. At first, it was just small things: letters about the color of my trash bin, a warning about my lawn being a quarter-inch too long. I brushed them off, thinking they were just being picky. After all, isn't that what HOAs are known for? Still, there was something in the tone of those notices that felt off, almost personal. It wasn't just about rules, it was about control. And slowly, I started to notice how closely they were watching. How every choice I made about my own home seemed to trigger another warning. I didn't know it yet, but those little slips of paper were the start of something much bigger. Something that would push me into a battle I never asked for, one where the rules weren't just annoying. They were life-altering. At first, I tried to play along. I thought maybe if I followed the rules, if I stayed quiet and kept my head down, the HOA would leave me alone. But the opposite happened. The more I complied, the more they demanded. It was almost like they sensed weakness, like a predator catching the scent of fear. The letters became constant, arriving in my mailbox every other day. Each one typed in the same cold, threatening language. Violation notice. Immediate attention required. They fined me for leaving my garbage can by the curb an hour too long. They fined me for planting flowers that weren't on their approved list. They even fined me for having a garden hose coiled up improperly on the side of my house. At first, I laughed it off. How could anyone care that much about a hose? But as the fines piled up, the humor drained away. I wasn't just living in a neighborhood anymore, I was living under surveillance. I couldn't walk outside without noticing someone watching, someone jotting down notes. It was suffocating. I started hearing whispers from neighbors. Some warned me. Others just shook their heads like they'd seen it all before. That's how they work, one said quietly, almost like they were afraid someone might overhear. They'll push you until you break. And that's exactly what they did. It began with a letter about my fence. The fence had been there since the house was built, weathered but still solid. But apparently, the HOA had suddenly decided it was unsightly. They gave me 30 days to replace it with an approved contractor. Of course, one who charged double the market price. I didn't have that kind of money lying around. When I asked if I could repair it myself, they flat out refused. That's when I realized this wasn't about keeping the neighborhood beautiful. This was about control. And worse, it was about money. Every time they forced a homeowner to use their approved contractors, someone in that HOA pocketed the profits. And if he resisted, they had ways of making your life miserable. The letters turned into threats. They said if I didn't replace the fence, they would place a lien on my home. Imagine that, the place I worked so hard to buy, the one piece of stability in my life, could be taken away because of a few weathered boards. I couldn't sleep at night. I started waking up to the sound of car doors slamming, headlights sweeping across my bedroom window as HOA board members did their so-called late-night inspections. I'd catch them parked in front of my home, clipboard in hand, staring at my property like vultures circling. Then came the final straw. One morning, I walked outside to find a bright orange notice taped to my door: failure to comply. According to the HOA, I owed thousands in unpaid fines they had stacked up from every petty violation they could dream of. They gave me 2 weeks to pay, or they would start foreclosure proceedings. 2 weeks. My hands shook as I read it. I wasn't just angry. I was terrified. They had pushed me into a corner. And now they were coming for the one thing that mattered most: my home. But here's the thing about being backed into a corner. Sometimes, it forces you to fight back. I started documenting everything. Every letter, every notice, every creepy late-night inspection. I took photos, recorded dates, kept a folder thicker than a phone book. And as I pieced it together, a pattern emerged: proof that what they were doing wasn't just unfair. It was illegal. I discovered that several board members had personal ties to the contractors they forced us to use. I found discrepancies in how they applied fines. Some homeowners got warnings. Others, like me, got punished immediately. And the liens, they weren't just threats. They had already taken homes from other families, flipping them for profit. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became. But anger wasn't enough. I needed a plan. I reached out to a few neighbors, quietly, people I trusted. At first, they were hesitant, scared even. But once I showed them my documentation, their eyes widened. They had stories too. One had been fined for hanging a flag on their porch. Another had been forced to rip out a perfectly healthy tree because it wasn't on the approved species list. Every single one of them felt powerless, trapped under the HOA's thumb. That's when I realized something powerful. I wasn't alone. Together, we started pushing back. We filed complaints with the county, with state regulators, anyone who would listen. We organized meetings, compared notes, and slowly the puzzle came together. It was bigger than any of us realized: systematic abuse of power, hidden under the guise of community rules. But the HOA wasn't about to go down without a fight. The board doubled their efforts, targeting me more aggressively than ever. They hired private security to patrol the neighborhood, which really meant following me every time I stepped outside. They sent threatening letters to my workplace, claiming I was a public nuisance. They even tried to smear my reputation with neighbors, calling me a troublemaker who didn't care about the community. The pressure was unbearable. Some nights, I thought about giving up, selling my house, walking away, cutting my losses. But then I'd look at that thick folder of evidence, and I knew I couldn't. Not just for me, but for every family they'd bullied, every home they'd stolen. And then, something happened that changed everything. One evening, as I sorted through another pile of violation notices, I got a call from a neighbor I barely knew. Their voice shook as they told me they had video evidence footage of an HOA board member trespassing on my property late at night, doing something they absolutely shouldn't have been doing. My heart raced. This wasn't just paperwork anymore. This was proof, undeniable proof, that the HOA was breaking the very laws they claimed to enforce. But what I did with that footage, well, that was the turning point. The move that would either save me or cost me everything. The footage landed in my hands on a flash drive the very next day. My neighbor, who had been too afraid to speak up before, handed it to me with trembling fingers. "You didn't get this from me," they whispered, eyes darting around the street as if the board might leap out of the shadows. I didn't know what to expect when I opened it. Maybe proof of them snooping, maybe a harmless walk across my lawn. But when the video loaded, my heart stopped. There they were, one of the most vocal board members, the very person who had signed half the violation notices shoved into my mailbox, creeping onto my property in the dead of night. The timestamp glared on the screen. 2:17 a.m. They weren't just trespassing. They were pulling something from their pocket, a paint scraper. And then I watched, frozen, as they scratched deep gouges across my fence, the same fence they had fined me thousands for not replacing. They weren't enforcing rules. They were manufacturing violations. My blood boiled. Every fine, every threat, every sleepless night suddenly had a new meaning. This wasn't about keeping the neighborhood beautiful. It was sabotage, pure and simple. They wanted me broken, financially and emotionally, so they could take my home. For the first time in months, I didn't feel fear. I felt something else: clarity. They had given me the weapon I needed, and I was going to use it. The next HOA meeting was already on the calendar. I marked a date, circled it in red, and waited. Every notice, every fine, every failure to comply letter went into a neat binder, the kind you'd carry into a courtroom. And that flash drive, that was my ace in the hole. When the night came, the room was packed. Neighbors lined the folding chairs, their faces worn with the same frustration I had seen in my own mirror. At the front of the room sat the board, smug as ever, clipboards stacked high with more violation reports. They didn't know what was coming. As they droned through their agenda trash can colors, acceptable mailbox styles, I sat quietly, waiting for my turn to speak. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it might shake the binder out of my hands. And then, finally, the chairwoman called my name. I stood. My voice was calm, steadier than I expected. "For months, this board has accused me of violating rules. You've fined me, threatened me, and even tried to take my home. But tonight, I'm here to show everyone the truth." A murmur rippled through the room. The board members exchanged nervous glances. I opened the binder, flipping through the stack of letters and fines, reading them aloud one by one. Each violation sounded more absurd than the last, and with every page I turned, I could feel the neighbors shifting in their seats. muttering under their breath. And then I pulled out the flash drive. "This," I said, holding it up for the room to see, "is what your board does when no one is looking." Gasps erupted as the video played on the projector screen. The board member appeared in grainy night vision, creeping across my lawn like a thief, vandalizing the very fence they claimed was a disgrace to the community. The room fell silent, except for the sound of the board member's breath caught on camera. The chairwoman's face turned pale. The guilty board member stammered, That's not what it looks like." But the damage was done. The neighbors weren't buying excuses. They were outraged. One by one, voices rose from the crowd. "They fined me for my garden lights. They made me tear down my kid's swing set. They're scamming us." The room erupted into chaos, years of pent-up frustration boiling over. I stood there, watching the tide turn, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time, the board wasn't in control. We were. But the board wasn't finished. The chairwoman slammed her gavel, shouting over the crowd, "This meeting is adjourned." She tried to shut it down, tried to bury the evidence before it spread further. But it was too late. I had already emailed the footage to every homeowner in the neighborhood. I had already filed complaints with the county and the state. The story wasn't going away. It was spreading like wildfire. And the board was standing in the middle of the flames. That night, the board left the meeting red-faced and silent. Neighbors clustered around me in the parking lot, thanking me, some even hugging me. "You just saved us," one whispered, tears in their eyes. But as satisfying as that moment was, I knew the fight wasn't over. Exposing them publicly was one thing. Holding them accountable was another. And the board, they weren't the type to go down quietly. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived in my mailbox. Not another violation notice. This one was worse. The board had filed a lawsuit against me for defamation. They claimed I had doctored the footage, fabricated the evidence, and damaged their reputation. It was a desperate move, but it was also dangerous. They were trying to drag me into court, bleed me dry with legal fees, and force me to back down. For a moment, I felt that old fear creeping back in. Maybe they could crush me, after all. Maybe I had pushed too hard. But then I opened my binder. Page after page of proof stared back at me. The letters, the fines, the video. I wasn't alone anymore, either. Neighbors were calling me daily, offering support, sharing their own evidence. We weren't just fighting an HOA anymore. We were fighting corruption. So I hired an attorney. Not just any attorney, but one who specialized in HOA abuse cases. When I laid out my evidence across their desk, they leaned back, smiled, and said, "They're finished." The day we stepped into court, the board expected me to fold. They came armed with their lawyers, their binders, their smug confidence. But they didn't expect the wave of neighbors who showed up to testify. They didn't expect the stack of affidavits detailing years of harassment. And they definitely didn't expect that video to be admitted into evidence, played on a massive courtroom screen for everyone to see. The moment the footage ended, the judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the board member caught red-handed. "Care to explain?" Silence. For the first time, the board had nothing to say. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Reporters scribbling notes, neighbors smiling through tears. It was the moment the tide turned for good. But even as I sat there, heart pounding with vindication, I knew this wasn't just about me anymore. This was bigger. This was about every family who had been bullied, every home they had stolen, every ounce of power they had abused. And as the judge prepared to deliver their ruling, I realized this was the moment everything changed. For me, for the neighborhood, for the HOA that thought they were untouchable. What happened next? Well, it left the entire courtroom in stunned silence. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. The video had played. The evidence had been laid out, piece by piece. For months, I had lived in fear of this HOA, certain they held all the power. But, at that moment, the weight shifted. The judge leaned forward, fingers steepled, and delivered words I'll never forget. This board's actions are not only unacceptable, they are unlawful. This case will proceed against them, not the homeowner. The board's faces drained of color. The very lawsuit they had filed against me had just flipped back onto them. It was poetic justice in its rawest form. Neighbors in the gallery erupted into quiet cheers and whispers, some even clapping until the bailiff silenced them. I just sat there, stunned, as the impossible became real. For so long I had been the target. Now, the target was them. The court didn't just dismiss their case. The judge authorized a deeper investigation, one that reached into every corner of the HOA's dealings. Within weeks, subpoenas went out, bank records were pulled, contracts with those so-called approved vendors were scrutinized, and one by one, the cracks began to show. It turned out the board had been running a scheme for years, padding their own pockets through inflated contracts, selectively enforcing rules to punish dissent, and threatening liens to force families into foreclosure. The money trail was undeniable. They weren't community leaders. They were predators. And now, the community saw it too. In an emergency vote, the homeowners rallied together like never before. Ballots were cast, voices raised, and within days, the entire board was ousted. People who had once been too scared to whisper their frustrations now stood tall, demanding accountability. For the first time, the HOA wasn't a weapon, it was a shield, rebuilt by the very people it was meant to protect. As for the board members, several faced civil lawsuits. Some even faced criminal charges once the extent of their fraud was uncovered. That smug confidence they once carried at every meeting was gone, replaced by court dates, lawyers, and a community they could no longer bully. For me, the relief was overwhelming. The liens were wiped away. The fines vanished. My fence, once labeled unsightly, became a symbol of everything we had endured and overcome. I no longer woke up at night to headlights outside my window. I no longer feared the sound of mail dropping into my box. The silence was sweet. The kind of peace I had dreamed of when I first moved there. But the impact went deeper than just my own life. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact at HOA meetings now stopped by to chat, to share coffee, to laugh about the absurd rules that no longer bound us. Kids played freely in their yards again. Families hung flags, planted flowers, and lived without fear of some clipboard-wielding tyrant knocking at their door. It felt like a neighborhood reborn. And yet, I couldn't ignore the scars. For months, I had lived under constant stress. My stomach twisted in knots every time I saw an envelope with a HOAS seal. That kind of fear doesn't vanish overnight. Even now, a part of me flinches when I see an official-looking letter